The summer heat was unbearable that afternoon in Redemption Creek. Dust devils danced across the main street, and the wooden buildings seemed to groan under the weight of the scorching sun. It was the kind of day where even the dogs didn't bother to bark, choosing instead to sleep in whatever shade they could find. Around 3 in the afternoon, a lone figure appeared on the horizon. He rode slowly, almost lazily, on a horse that had seen better days. As he got closer, people could make out his features. He was old, probably in his 60s, with gray hair poking out from under a worn black hat. His face was weathered and lined, like leather left too long in the sun. He wore a long duster coat that was faded and patched in several places, and his boots were scuffed and dusty. The old man rode down the main street without looking left or right. A few shopkeepers paused to watch him pass, but most folks just went about their business. Strangers weren't unusual in Redemption Creek. The town sat along one of the old cattle trails, and drifters passed through all the time looking for work or just a place to rest before moving on. He stopped his horse outside the Silver Dollar Saloon, the largest drinking establishment in town. The building had a false front that made it look bigger than it actually was, and the paint was peeling in long strips. A sign hung crooked above the door, creaking slightly in the hot breeze. The old man dismounted slowly, like his joints were stiff, and tied his horse to the hitching post. He gave the animal a gentle pat on the neck before climbing the 3 wooden steps to the entrance. Inside the saloon it was cooler, but not by much. The place smelled of stale beer, tobacco smoke, and sawdust. About a dozen men were scattered around the room, some playing cards, others just drinking and talking in low voices. A few working girls sat at a corner table, fanning themselves and looking bored. The piano player had taken a break, so the only sounds were the clink of glasses and the murmur of conversation. Dutch, the bartender, was a big man with a handlebar mustache and sharp eyes that missed nothing. He'd owned the Silver Dollar for 15 years and had seen every type of person imaginable walk through those doors. When the old stranger entered, Dutch watched him carefully, the way he always did with newcomers. The old man walked straight to the bar without glancing around. His boots made a soft shuffling sound on the wooden floor, and his spurs barely jingled. That was the first thing Dutch noticed. Most cowboys' spurs made a racket when they walked, but this man moved quietly, almost like he didn't want to be heard. "Whiskey," the old man said. His voice was rough, like gravel being poured from a bucket. Dutch poured a shot and slid it across the bar. 50 cents. The old man placed exact change on the counter. His hands were tanned and scarred, with thick calluses on the palms. They were working hands, but they were also steady. Rock steady. Dutch had seen plenty of drunks and nervous men in his time, and their hands always shook a little. This man's hands were as solid as the bar itself. The stranger took his whiskey and walked to a corner table, the one with its back to the wall and a clear view of the entire room. He sat down slowly, removed his hat and placed it on the table, then took a small sip of his drink. After that, he just sat there quiet as a church mouse, looking at nothing in particular. The other customers glanced at him once or twice, but nobody paid him much attention. He looked like a retired ranch hand or maybe a former prospector down on his luck. Nothing special, nothing dangerous. Just another old-timer counting down his final years, but Dutch kept watching him. There was something about the way the man held himself. Despite his age and his worn-out appearance, there was a certain awareness in his eyes. They moved slowly across the room, taking in every person, every door, every window. It wasn't obvious. If you weren't looking for it, you'd miss it entirely. But Dutch had been a soldier once back during the war, and he recognized that particular habit. It was the behavior of someone who'd lived a dangerous life and survived by always knowing what was happening around them. The old man sat there for about an hour, nursing that one glass of whiskey. He didn't talk to anyone, didn't ask questions, didn't even nod hello to the other customers. He just sat and watched and occasionally took a tiny sip from his glass. Around 4:30, a young cowboy named Billy stumbled over to the old man's table. Billy had been drinking since noon and was feeling brave. He planted both hands on the table and leaned forward with a stupid grin on his face. "Hey there, old-timer," Billy slurred. "You look like you could use some company. Why don't you tell us some stories about the old days?" The old man looked up at Billy with those calm, steady eyes. "Not interested in talking, son. Just want to drink in peace." Billy laughed and turned to his friends at the bar. "You hear that, boys? He wants peace. Maybe he's one of them religious types." His friends chuckled, but it was nervous laughter. Something about the old man made them uncomfortable, though they couldn't say exactly what. The old man didn't respond. He just took another sip of whiskey and went back to looking at the wall. Billy stood there for another moment, feeling foolish, then shrugged and walked back to his friends. After that, everyone left the stranger alone. As evening approached and the saloon started filling up with more customers, Dutch found himself glancing at the corner table more and more. The old man hadn't moved except to occasionally lift his glass. His coat hung open just enough that Dutch could see something underneath, a flash of metal. A gun, of course. Most men carried guns. But there was something about the way this one wore his that seemed different. It sat just right, positioned perfectly for a quick draw. That was another thing Dutch noticed. The wear patterns on the man's holster suggested it had been drawn thousands of times. Dutch had been around plenty of gunfighters in his day. The young hotshots who came looking for reputations, the outlaws who drank too much and talked too loud, the hired guns who killed for money, but this old man didn't fit any of those categories. He didn't have the swagger of a gunfighter or the meanness of an outlaw. He just seemed tired and watchful. Around sunset, Dutch walked over to the corner table with a bottle. "Mind if I freshen that up for you?" The old man looked up and gave the smallest nod. Dutch poured another shot, then stood there for a moment, working up his nerve. "Don't mean to pry, but you planning on staying in town long?" "Just passing through," the old man replied. "Thought I'd rest here a day or two." "That a problem?" "No problem at all," Dutch said quickly. "We got a boarding house down the street if you need a room. Mrs. Chen runs it. Clean beds, fair prices." The old man nodded his thanks, and Dutch returned to the bar. As he walked away, he had a strange feeling in his gut. A feeling that something was about to happen. Something big. He couldn't explain it, but 30 years of living on the frontier had taught him to trust his instincts. The old man finished his second whiskey as darkness fell outside. He stood slowly, placed a few coins on the table for Dutch, and walked out of the saloon. Through the window, Dutch watched him lead his horse down toward the boarding house. As the door swung shut behind the stranger, one of the regular customers, a retired lawman named Pete, moved closer to the bar. He'd been watching the old man too. "Dutch," he said quietly, "did you notice his hands?" "Yeah," Dutch replied. "Steady as a rock," Pete nodded slowly. "And the way he sat with his back to the wall, and how his eyes never stopped moving." He paused and took a long drink. "That ain't no ordinary drifter." Dutch wiped down the bar and said nothing, but he agreed completely. That definitely wasn't an ordinary drifter. That was someone with a past, someone who'd lived through things most men wouldn't survive, someone who probably had a lot of stories to tell but chose to keep them locked up inside. The question was, what had brought him to Redemption Creek? And more importantly, would his past stay buried, or was it about to catch up with him? Dutch would get his answers soon enough. Much sooner than he wanted. 2 days passed quietly in Redemption Creek. The old man, who had introduced himself to Mrs. Chen as simply Clay, kept to himself. He spent most of his time on the porch of the boarding house, sitting in a rocking chair and watching the street. He ate his meals alone, took short walks around town, and visited the Silver Dollar each evening for a single glass of whiskey. He spoke only when spoken to, and even then his answers were short and polite. The townspeople had mostly forgotten about him by the third morning. He'd become just another piece of the scenery, like the water trough or the hitching posts. But that was about to change. It was around 10 in the morning when the sound of horses caught everyone's attention. Not just one or two horses, but several, moving fast and raising a cloud of dust that could be seen from half a mile away. People stopped what they were doing and looked toward the edge of town. 7 riders were coming in hard, and they weren't slowing down. The riders thundered into town like they owned the place. They whooped and hollered, firing their pistols into the air just for the fun of it. Dogs scattered, and people jumped out of their way as they raced down the main street. They finally pulled up in front of the Silver Dollar Saloon, their horses snorting and stamping in the dust. The leader of the group was a young man in his mid-20s with long blonde hair and a cocky grin. He wore fancy clothes, the kind that cost real money, including a black vest with silver buttons and a red bandana around his neck. 2 revolvers hung low on his hips, and he handled them like they were extensions of his own hands. This was Jake Hollis, and anyone who knew anything about outlaws in the territory had heard of him. Next to Jake sat his younger brother, Colt. He was maybe 22 or 23, with the same blonde hair but meaner eyes. Where Jake seemed playful and charming in a dangerous way, Colt was just plain cruel. He liked hurting people, and it showed in the way he looked at the townspeople like they were insects he might step on just because he could. The other 5 men in their gang were a rough bunch. Hard faces, cold eyes, and the kind of scars that came from knife fights and shootouts. They spread out along the street, blocking it off so nobody could easily leave or enter. Jake Hollis dismounted and stretched like he'd just woken up from a nap. "Well, boys," he announced loudly, "looks like we found ourselves a nice quiet little town. Real peaceful-like." His gang laughed at that, because everyone knew that when the Hollis brothers showed up, peace was the last thing anyone could expect. They trooped into the Silver Dollar Saloon, their spurs jingling and their boots heavy on the wooden floor. Dutch was behind the bar, and his heart sank when he saw them walk in. He'd heard stories about the Hollis brothers. Bad stories. They were wanted in 3 territories for robbery, murder, and worse. And here they were in his saloon, looking for trouble. Jake walked right up to the bar and slammed his hand down on the counter. "Bartender, drinks for me and my boys, and make them good ones, not that watered-down swill you probably serve the locals." Dutch started pouring whiskey with shaking hands. "That'll be $3.50, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Jake laughed and looked back at his brother. "Did you hear that, Colt? He wants us to pay," the gang roared with laughter. Jake turned back to Dutch and leaned in close. "Here's how this works, friend. We drink for free, and if you got a problem with that, we can discuss it outside. How's that sound?" Dutch swallowed hard and nodded. "No problem. On the house." "That's what I thought," Jake said, grabbing his glass. He downed it in one gulp and slammed it back on the bar for a refill. Colt Hollis was wandering around the saloon, looking at everything like he was shopping for things to steal. He kicked over a spittoon just to watch it spill, then laughed when one of the customers had to jump out of the way. "This is a sad little place, brother," he called out. "Barely worth robbing." "Oh, I don't know," Jake replied, pouring himself another drink. "I heard there's a bank here that does pretty good business. All those ranchers and miners deposit their money here. Might be worth a visit later today." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear, wanting them to be afraid. And they were. The saloon had gone completely silent. The card players had abandoned their game. The working girls had disappeared upstairs. Even the piano player had vanished. The only people left were Dutch behind the bar, a handful of terrified customers, and one old man sitting alone in the corner. Clay hadn't moved since the gang entered. He sat at his usual table, his back to the wall, with a half-empty glass of whiskey in front of him. He appeared to be looking at nothing in particular, but his eyes were taking in everything. He watched the brothers, counted the gang members, noted their weapons, and calculated their behavior patterns. He did all this without seeming to pay any attention at all. Colt noticed the old man after a few minutes. "Hey, look at this," he said, pointing. "We got ourselves a real fossil over there. Old man probably remembers when dinosaurs walked the earth." The gang laughed again, always ready to join in on their boss's jokes. Clay took a sip of his whiskey and said nothing. He didn't even look in Colt's direction. This was a mistake. Colt Hollis didn't like being ignored. "Hey, old-timer," Colt called out, walking toward Clay's table. "I'm talking to you. You deaf or just stupid?" Clay slowly lifted his eyes and looked at Colt. His expression was completely neutral, showing nothing. "Just drinking," he said quietly. "Don't want any trouble?" "Don't want any trouble," Colt repeated in a mocking voice. "Ain't that sweet?" He turned to his gang. "Old man here don't want any trouble. Maybe we should help him out. Maybe we should make sure he gets exactly what he wants." The gang chuckled, sensing that their entertainment was about to begin. Jake Hollis joined his brother, drink in hand. He was the smarter of the two, and something about the old man caught his attention. Maybe it was the way he sat so still. Maybe it was the calmness in his eyes. Whatever it was, Jake felt a small warning bell go off in his head. But he ignored it. After all, what could one old man possibly do? "My brother asked you a question, old-timer," Jake said, his voice friendlier but no less dangerous. "Where are your manners? When the Hollis brothers talk to you, you stand up and show respect." Clay looked from Jake to Colt and back again. He seemed to be thinking about something, weighing his options. Finally, he spoke. "You boys sure you want to do this?" It was a strange thing to say, and for just a second both brothers hesitated. There was something in the old man's voice. Not fear, not anger, just a kind of tired resignation. like he'd been through this exact situation 100 times before and knew exactly how it would end. But Colt recovered quickly. He pulled out his revolver and pointed it at Clay's face. "Old man, I don't think you understand your situation here. We can do whatever we want. We're the Hollis brothers. We've killed men for less than the disrespect you're showing us right now." Clay nodded slowly. "I'm sure you have, son. I'm sure you have." He took another sip of his whiskey, completely ignoring the gun pointed at his head. This shocked everyone in the room. Who drinks whiskey with a gun in their face? Jake moved around behind Clay's chair, blocking any chance of escape. The other gang members spread out, covering the doors and windows. They'd done this before many times. Intimidation was their specialty. They'd corner someone, scare them half to death, and then either rob them or beat them just for fun. It was a game to them, and they were very good at it. "Let me tell you how this is going to work," Colt said, pressing his gun against Clay's temple. "You're going to give us whatever money you got. Then you're going to get down on your knees and apologize for being disrespectful. And then, if we're feeling generous, we might let you crawl out of here with your life. How's that sound?" Clay set down his whiskey glass very carefully. His hands remained on the table in plain sight. He looked tired, like he'd worked a long, hard day and just wanted to rest. When he spoke, his voice was even quieter than before. "Boys, I'm going to ask you one more time. Are you absolutely sure you want to do this?" Colt laughed and looked at his brother. "Can you believe this guy? He thinks he's in a position to ask questions." He turned back to Clay. "Yeah, old man. We're sure, real sure. Now, you going to give us that money? Or do we need to take it off your corpse?" The other customers in the saloon were frozen in fear. Dutch gripped the bar so hard his knuckles turned white. Everyone expected the old man to break down, to beg for his life, to do whatever the Hollis brothers wanted. That's what sensible people did when cornered by killers. But Clay didn't do any of those things. Instead, he asked one final question. "Do you boys know who I am?" The question hung in the air like smoke. It was such a simple question, but something about the way he asked it made everyone pause. Even Colt's finger on the trigger hesitated. Jake laughed, trying to break the tension. "Should we know who you are? You somebody important? You the president, maybe?" The gang laughed, but it was nervous laughter now. Behind the bar, Dutch felt a cold chill run down his spine. That question, that specific question, he'd heard it before a long time ago, and suddenly pieces started falling into place in his mind. The steady hands, the watchful eyes, the way the man moved so quietly, the positioning of his gun. The tension in the Silver Dollar Saloon was thick enough to cut with a knife. Colt Hollis still had his gun pressed against Clay's temple, and Jake stood behind the old man's chair, blocking any escape. The rest of their gang had spread out around the room, hands on their weapons, ready for anything. Clay sat perfectly still, his weathered hands resting flat on the table. He looked at Colt with those calm, steady eyes and waited for an answer to his question. "Do you boys know who I am?" Colt's finger tightened on the trigger. "I don't care if you're God himself, old man. You're about 3 seconds away from meeting him in person." But even as he said it, there was a slight uncertainty in his voice. Something about the situation felt wrong, but he couldn't figure out what. Jake was feeling it too. In all their years of robbing and killing, they'd developed good instincts for danger. Those instincts had kept them alive when smarter outlaws had ended up dead. And right now those instincts were screaming at him that something wasn't right. But his pride wouldn't let him back down. Not in front of his gang. Not in front of his younger brother. "Last chance, old-timer," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "Tell us who you are, give us your money, and maybe we'll let you walk out of here." Clay sighed, a long, tired sound. "All right, then. My name is Clayton Morrison. Some folks used to call me the Clay Ghost." He said it simply, like he was mentioning the weather. For a moment, nothing happened. The name didn't register with most people in the room. But then Dutch made a sound, something between a gasp and a groan. Pete, the old lawman, dropped his glass and it shattered on the floor. "Holy mother of—" Pete whispered, backing away from his table. The Hollis brothers looked confused. "Clay Ghost?" Colt said. "That's supposed to mean something to us?" But one of their gang members, an older outlaw named Wilson, had gone white as a sheet. "Boys," he said, his voice shaking. "We need to leave." "Right now." Jake turned to look at him. "What are you talking about?" Wilson was already backing toward the door. "That's Clayton Morrison, the bounty hunter. The one they tell stories about. He's killed more men than cholera." "He's not a killer," Dutch said from behind the bar, finally finding his voice. but he's brought in more outlaws than any lawman in the territory. Maybe 60 men or more. Dangerous men. Whole gangs. He looked at the Hollis brothers. Boys, you need to let him go. Right now, Colt laughed, but it sounded forced. You're telling me this old fossil is some kind of famous bounty hunter? Look at him. He's practically falling apart. But Jake was remembering stories now. Stories he'd heard around campfires and in hideouts. Tales about a bounty hunter who could track anyone, anywhere. A man who'd walked into camps full of armed outlaws and walked out with every single one of them in chains or over a saddle. They said he was like a ghost appearing out of nowhere, impossible to kill, never missing a shot. But those stories were from 15, maybe 20 years ago. Most people figured the Clay ghost was dead by now. And even if he wasn't dead, he'd be too old to be dangerous. Right? Jake studied the old man more carefully. The weathered face. The gray hair. The slight stoop in his shoulders. Could this really be the legendary Clayton Morrison? It seemed impossible. Even if you are who you say you are, Jake said slowly. That was a long time ago. You're old now, slow. Your best days are behind you. Clay nodded in agreement. You're probably right about that. I am old, I am slow, and my best days are definitely behind me. He paused. But I'm still better than you boys. And deep down you know it? Colt's face flushed red with anger. You arrogant old fool. He pressed the gun harder against Clay's head. I could blow your brains out right now. You could, Clay agreed. But you won't. Why not? Colt demanded. Because you're curious now, Clay said calmly. You're wondering if the stories are true. You're wondering if maybe, just maybe, you bit off more than you can chew. He smiled slightly. And that hesitation is going to cost you. The room had gone completely silent except for the sound of breathing and the ticking of the old clock on the wall. Every eye was on the standoff in the corner. The regular customers were pressed against the walls, trying to make themselves invisible. Dutch had slowly reached under the bar where he kept a shotgun, just in case things went bad. Jake made a decision. He couldn't back down now. His reputation depended on it. All right, old man. Let's say you are Clayton Morrison. Let's say the stories are true. That still doesn't change the fact that you're surrounded by 7 armed men, and one of them has a gun to your head. What exactly do you think you're going to do about it? Clay looked around the room, his eyes moving from one gang member to another. He seemed to be calculating something, working out a problem in his head. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet everyone had to strain to hear him. Well, first I'm going to break your brother's wrist so he drops that gun. Then I'm going to draw my own weapon and shoot Wilson in the shoulder, because he's the most experienced one here, and he'll be reaching for his gun first. After that, I'll put a round into the support beam above us, which will bring down that chandelier and create enough confusion for me to take cover behind this table. From there, I'll disable the rest of your boys one by one, and when it's all over, I'll have 7 wanted men ready to collect bounties on, and this town will be a safer place. He said it all in the same tone someone might use to describe their plans for planting a garden. Casual, matter of fact. Like it was the most natural thing in the world. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Then Colt laughed, a harsh, mocking sound. You're insane, old man. Completely insane. Maybe, Clay admitted. But I'm also right. That's exactly how this is going to play out. Jake's hand moved toward his own gun. You're bluffing. Nobody's that fast. Nobody's that good. Especially not someone your age. Clay's expression didn't change. Only one way to find out, son. The standoff stretched out. Seconds felt like hours. The clock ticked. Someone's stomach growled. A fly buzzed near the window. Everything seemed frozen in time, waiting for someone to make the first move. Dutch could see it building. He'd been in enough fights to recognize the moment right before violence exploded. It was like watching storm clouds gather before a tornado touched down. He wanted to shout, to break the tension, to stop what was about to happen, but his voice caught in his throat. Pete, the old lawman, had quietly moved toward the door. He'd heard enough stories about Clayton Morrison to believe every word the old man said. If shooting was about to start, Pete wanted to be somewhere else. Anywhere else. One of the younger gang members, a kid who couldn't have been more than 19, was visibly shaking. His gun hand trembled and sweat ran down his face despite the relative coolness inside the saloon. He'd joined the Hollis gang thinking it would be exciting, that he'd make easy money and build a reputation. But right now all he wanted was to be back home helping his father with the farm. Wilson, the experienced outlaw, had already taken several steps toward the door. He'd survived this long by knowing when to fight and when to run. Every instinct he had was screaming at him to run. Clay noticed Wilson's movement and gave him a slight nod, almost like he was granting permission. "Smart man," he said quietly. "You might want to keep going. What's about to happen here isn't going to be pretty." But Wilson stopped. He couldn't leave. The Hollis brothers paid well, and besides, running would mark him as a coward. In their world, reputation was everything. If word got out that he'd abandoned his gang because of one old man, he'd never find work again. Colt was getting impatient. The old man's calmness was starting to unnerve him, and he didn't like it. He was used to people being afraid, begging, crying. This quiet confidence was something else entirely. "I'm done listening to this crazy talk," Colt announced. "Old man, you got exactly 3 seconds to hand over your money or I swear I'll—" Clay cut him off. "Or you'll what, kill me? Son, better men than you have tried. Some of them were faster. Some of them were meaner. All of them are dead or in prison now." He paused. "But I gave you boys a chance. I asked you twice if you were sure about this. You said yes. So whatever happens next, remember, you chose this." Jake felt a cold finger of fear trace down his spine. Something about the way the old man spoke, the absolute certainty in his voice, made him believe every word. But it was too late to back out now. They'd pushed too far. The only way forward was through. "Colt," Jake said quietly. "On 3 we take him. I'll grab his arms, you keep that gun on him, and the boys will cover us." "Nice and simple," Colt nodded, his confidence returning now that they had a plan. "Yeah, nice and simple." Clay heard every word. He took one last look around the room, memorizing positions, calculating angles, preparing for what had to be done. Then he closed his eyes for just a moment, like he was saying a silent prayer or maybe just gathering his strength. When he opened them again, something had changed. The tired old man was gone. In his place was something else entirely. Something harder. Something dangerous. The Clay ghost had awakened. "All right, boys," Clay said softly. "Let's dance." What happened next would be talked about in saloons and around campfires for years to come. People would argue about the details, with each person remembering it slightly differently, but everyone agreed on one thing. They had never seen anything like it before, and they probably never would again. Jake started counting. 1. Clay's muscles tensed, imperceptible to most eyes, but every fiber of his being was now focused on survival. His mind raced through the plan he'd already formed, adjusting for variables, calculating risks. 2. In the split second before Jake said 3, Clay moved, and when Clayton Morrison moved, it was like watching lightning strike. His right leg shot out in a vicious kick that caught the underside of the table. The heavy wooden table flipped up with surprising force, its edge slamming into Colt's stomach. The younger Hollis brother let out a grunt of pain and surprise, his gun hand flying upward. In the same fluid motion, Clay's hand flashed to the gun hidden under his coat. It was a movement he'd practiced 10,000 times, maybe more. The draw was so fast it seemed like the gun had simply appeared in his hand. His first shot rang out before Colt even realized what was happening. The bullet hit Colt's gun hand right across the knuckles. His revolver went spinning through the air, and Colt screamed, clutching his bleeding hand. Clay had deliberately aimed to wound, not to kill. He could have put that bullet through Colt's heart just as easily. But that wasn't his way. Jake Hollis reached for his own guns, but Clay was already moving again. The old man rolled to his left with surprising agility, coming up behind the overturned table just as Jake's bullets tore through the space where he'd been sitting a heartbeat before. Wilson, the experienced outlaw, was indeed reaching for his weapon. Exactly as Clay had predicted, Clay's second shot caught him in the meat of his shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun clattering across the floor. Wilson went down, howling in pain but very much alive. The saloon erupted into chaos. The other gang members started shooting, their bullets splintering the wooden table Clay was using for cover. Splinters flew everywhere, and the smell of gunpowder filled the air. The few remaining customers dove for cover, and Dutch dropped behind his bar. Clay remained calm, his mind working like a well-oiled machine. He'd been in situations like this before many times. The key was to stay focused, to think 3 moves ahead, to never panic. Panicking got you killed. Planning kept you alive. He aimed carefully and fired his third shot. The bullet struck the chain holding the large chandelier that hung in the center of the saloon. The chain snapped and the chandelier came crashing down in a cascade of breaking glass and twisted metal. It landed right between Clay and the gang members, and several of the oil lamps inside it shattered, creating a wall of smoke and darkness. "He's behind the table," Jake shouted, trying to organize his gang. "Spread out. Surround him." But Clay was no longer behind the table. Using the smoke and confusion as cover, he'd already moved to a new position behind one of the thick support beams that held up the second floor. From there, he had a clear view of most of the room while remaining mostly hidden himself. Two of the gang members rushed toward the overturned table, guns blazing. They thought they had Clay pinned down. They were wrong. Clay fired twice, both shots hitting them in the legs. They went down hard, their guns skittering away across the floor. That left Jake, Colt, and two others still standing. But Colt was out of the fight, cradling his shattered hand and whimpering in pain. The two remaining gang members were young and inexperienced, and the reality of the situation was starting to dawn on them. They weren't hunting an old man. They were being hunted. "Get him," Jake screamed. "There's only one of him. Get him!" One of the young outlaws, the 19-year-old kid, made the mistake of showing himself. He stepped out from behind a table, gun raised, searching for a target. Clay didn't even hesitate. His shot took the gun right out of the kid's hand along with a piece of his trigger finger. The kid dropped to his knees, crying and clutching his hand. "Stay down, son," Clay called out to him. "Stay down and you'll live through this." The kid didn't need to be told twice. He crawled under a table and curled up, praying this nightmare would end. Jake was starting to realize that this wasn't going according to plan. Not even close. In less than a minute, his entire gang had been taken apart by one old man. Wounded, disarmed, demoralized. And the worst part was, Clay hadn't killed anyone. Every shot had been precise, measured, designed to disable rather than execute. "You boys should surrender," Clay called out from his position. His voice was steady, like he was discussing the price of beef instead of fighting for his life. "Nobody else needs to get hurt here. Go to hell," Jake shouted back. He fired several wild shots in Clay's direction, but they all went wide, hitting the support beam and the wall behind it. Clay shook his head. Young men in their pride. It got them in trouble every single time. He quickly reloaded his revolver, his fingers moving with practiced efficiency. He'd done this same motion hundreds of times in the dark, in the rain, on horseback, under pressure. It was second nature to him now. The remaining gang member, a tough-looking man named Briggs, tried a different approach. He circled around, attempting to flank Clay from the side. It was actually a smart move, the kind of tactic that might have worked against a lesser opponent. But Clay had been tracking Briggs's footsteps the entire time, hearing each creak of the floorboards, each scuff of boots on wood. As Briggs rounded the corner, gun raised, he found himself staring down the barrel of Clay's revolver. For a frozen moment, their eyes met. Briggs saw death looking back at him and knew, without a shadow of doubt, that if Clay wanted him dead, he would be dead. But Clay's finger didn't pull the trigger. Instead, he shifted his aim slightly and shot the gun out of Briggs's hand. Briggs yelped in pain and surprise, dropping his weapon. Clay's boot lashed out, catching Briggs in the knee. The outlaw went down with a cry, his leg buckling under him. "Stay down," Clay ordered, and Briggs was more than happy to oblige. Now it was just Jake Hollis left standing. The gang leader looked around at his fallen comrades, unable to believe what had just happened. 7 men, all armed, all dangerous, and they'd been taken apart like they were children playing with toy guns. Jake's hands were shaking now, and not from fear. It was rage, pure burning rage. His reputation was ruined. His gang was finished. All because of one old man who should have been sitting in a rocking chair somewhere, not fighting like he was 20 years old again. "You think you're so smart," Jake screamed. "You think you're so tough. But you're just a tired old man living in the past." Clay stepped out from behind the support beam, his gun still trained on Jake. In the dim light and smoke-filled room, he looked almost supernatural. His gray hair was wild, his coat was torn, and there was a cut on his cheek from a flying splinter. But his eyes were sharp as ever, and his gun hand was steady as stone. "You're right," Clay said calmly. "I am old. I am tired. And I am living in the past." He took a step forward. "But I'm also still standing and your gang is on the ground. So maybe the past isn't as weak as you think." Jake raised both his guns, pointing them at Clay. His fingers were on the triggers, ready to fire. But he hesitated. Something in Clay's eyes stopped him. The old bounty hunter wasn't afraid. Not even a little bit. He stood there like a man who'd faced death so many times it had become an old friend. "Don't do it, son," Clay said quietly. "You're young. You made bad choices, but you can still have a future. You pull those triggers and I will put you down. I don't want to, but I will." "Is your pride really worth dying for?" The question hung in the air between them. The saloon had gone silent except for the groans of the wounded and the crackle of a small fire that had started where the chandelier fell. Everyone waited to see what Jake Hollis would decide. Jake's mind raced. He could try to shoot. He was fast, probably faster than most men, but was he faster than the Clay ghost? The evidence lying all around him suggested he wasn't. In the past minute, he'd watched Clay move like a man possessed, hitting every target, never missing, never hesitating. And then there was the matter of the bounties on their heads. If Jake surrendered, he'd go to prison, probably for a long time, but he'd be alive. If he fought, he'd probably die right here in this dirty saloon, and for what? Pride, reputation? Slowly, very slowly, Jake lowered his guns. "I surrender," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It was the hardest thing he'd ever said in his life. Clay nodded. "Smart choice. Now put the guns down easy and kick them over to me." Jake did as he was told, his face burning with shame. Behind him, Colt was still whimpering, and the rest of the gang was scattered across the saloon floor, none of them in any condition to fight. From behind the bar, Dutch slowly stood up, his eyes wide with amazement. "I can't believe what I just saw," he whispered. Pete, the old lawman, emerged from where he'd been hiding near the door. "Neither can I, and I've seen a lot in my day." He looked at Clay with something like awe. "The stories don't do you justice, Mr. Morrison." Clay holstered his gun and took a deep breath. His heart was pounding, and his old joints were already starting to ache from the sudden movement. He wasn't a young man anymore, and fights like this took their... The Silver Dollar Saloon looked like a tornado had torn through it. Overturned tables, broken glass everywhere, bullet holes in the walls, and 7 wounded outlaws scattered across the floor. The smell of gunpowder hung heavy in the air, mixed with the smoke from the small fires that were quickly being put out. Clay stood in the middle of it all, breathing heavily. Now that the adrenaline was wearing off, he could feel every one of his 60-plus years. His back ached. His knees hurt, and his hands were starting to tremble slightly from the strain. He'd pushed his aging body hard, maybe harder than he should have, but it had gotten the job done. Dutch came out from behind the bar carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. His hands were shaking worse than Clay's, but he managed to pour 2 shots without spilling too much. He slid one across a table to Clay. "On the house," Dutch said. "Hell, everything's on the house for you from now on, Mr. Morrison." Clay took the glass and downed it in one swallow. The whiskey burned going down, but it was a good burn. It helped steady his nerves and warm his insides. "Much obliged," he said quietly. Pete, the old lawman, was already taking charge of the situation. He'd found some rope and was starting to tie up the gang members who could still move. Jake Hollis sat slumped against a wall, staring at nothing. His guns lay on the floor several feet away, and his whole world had collapsed in the space of a few minutes. "Someone run and get Doc Stevens," Pete called out. "These boys are bleeding pretty good. And somebody find Sheriff Taylor. Tell him to get down here right away." A young man ran out the door to fetch help. The remaining customers and townspeople started emerging from their hiding places, all of them staring at Clay with a mixture of fear and respect. They'd just witnessed something extraordinary, and they knew they'd be telling this story for the rest of their lives. Colt Hollis was crying now, cradling his ruined hand. Blood dripped between his fingers, and his face was pale from pain and shock. "You broke my hand," he whimpered. "You broke my shooting hand." Clay looked at him without much sympathy. "Better than breaking your neck, which is what you would have gotten from a rope eventually. At least this way you're alive." He paused. "And maybe if you're smart, you'll use that left hand to do something useful instead of holding a gun." Wilson, the older outlaw, was sitting propped against a wall, his shoulder bleeding but not critically. He looked at Clay with a mixture of respect and resignation. "I knew who you were," he said. "Soon as you said your name, I knew. I should have run." "Yes, you should have," Clay agreed. "But I'm guessing the Hollis brothers don't take kindly to people running out on them." Wilson nodded grimly. "Probably would have shot me in the back." "Well, now you'll have time to think about your life choices in a nice, comfortable jail cell," Clay said. There was no mockery in his voice, just a statement of fact. The doctor arrived within 10 minutes, a middle-aged man with gray hair and a no-nonsense attitude. Doc Stevens had seen plenty of gunshot wounds in his time, but even he was impressed by what he saw. All of them are wounded, but none of them are dying, he observed. That takes real skill, Clay shrugged. No point in killing when you don't have to. The doctor started working on the outlaws, beginning with those who were bleeding the most. He cleaned wounds, bandaged hands, dug out bullets, and generally patched up the gang as best he could. They'd all live, though some of them would carry scars and limitations for the rest of their lives. Sheriff Taylor arrived shortly after, a big man in his 50s with a thick mustache and a star on his chest. He took one look at the scene and whistled low. "Pete, what in the name of heaven happened here?" Pete explained the situation quickly, pointing out each gang member and describing what had happened. The sheriff's eyes got wider as the story went on, and he kept glancing at Clay like he couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. "The Hollis brothers," Sheriff Taylor said slowly. "You took down the Hollis brothers and their entire gang by yourself?" "They didn't give me much choice," Clay replied. "I asked them twice to leave me alone. They insisted on making things difficult." The sheriff walked over to Jake Hollis and looked down at him. "Jake Hollis, been hunting you boys for 2 years. There's paper on you in 3 territories. Murder, robbery, assault, horse theft, and about a dozen other charges." He shook his head in amazement. "Never thought I'd see the day you'd surrender." Jake looked up at the sheriff with dull eyes. "That old man in the corner gave me a choice. Die here or face a judge. I chose to face the judge." Sheriff Taylor looked back at Clay with newfound respect. "Smart choice, son. If half the stories about Clayton Morrison are true, you're lucky to be breathing right now." He turned to his deputies who had arrived with him. "Boys, get these outlaws over to the jail. Make sure they're secure. We got ourselves quite a haul here." As the deputies started hauling the gang members to their feet and leading them out, Jake Hollis paused near Clay. He looked like he wanted to say something, and after a moment he found his voice. "How did you move that fast?" he asked. "You're old." "How were you so fast?" Clay considered the question. "Speed isn't just about how quick you move, son. It's about knowing what's going to happen before it happens. You boys telegraphed your every move. I just reacted to what I already knew was coming." Jake nodded slowly, absorbing this information. "My brother was right about one thing. You are from a different time. They don't make men like you anymore." "Sure they do," Clay replied. "They just don't last long in your line of work. Most of them end up dead or in prison before they're 30. He looked Jake in the eye. "You're what, 25? You got lucky today. Use this as a wake-up call. Whatever time you have to serve, use it to think about the choices you made and who you want to be when you get out." The deputy led Jake away before he could respond. Colt was next, still whimpering about his hand. One by one, the gang members were taken to the jail until the saloon was empty of outlaws. The townspeople who had witnessed everything slowly started talking among themselves. The volume grew as everyone tried to process what they'd seen. Some were already embellishing the story, adding details that hadn't happened. By tomorrow, the tale would have grown even larger, and by next week it would be legendary. Dutch started cleaning up the mess, sweeping broken glass and righting overturned tables. Several townspeople pitched in to help. Clay wanted to help too, feeling guilty about the damage, but Dutch wouldn't hear of it. "Mr. Morrison, you just saved this town from a gang of killers. The least I can do is clean up some broken furniture." He paused. "Besides, once word gets out about what happened here, this place is going to be packed every night. Everyone will want to see where the Clay ghost made his last stand. I'll probably have to buy new furniture anyway, just to handle the crowds." Sheriff Taylor returned after getting the prisoners secured. He walked up to Clay with an official-looking paper in his hand. "Mr. Morrison, I've got good news for you. There are active bounties on all 7 of those men. Jake Hollis is worth $2,000 alone. His brother is worth $1,500. The rest are worth between $300 and $800 each. All told, you're looking at about $8,000 in bounty money." Clay raised his eyebrows. That was a significant sum of money. More than most people made in several years. $8,000, he repeated. "That's quite a lot." "It's what you're owed," the sheriff said. "You brought them in alive, which is even better. Saved the state the cost of a trial if they were dead." He held out his hand. "I'll process the paperwork and have the money for you within a week." "Will you be staying in town that long?" Clay thought about it. He'd planned to leave Redemption Creek after a day or 2 of rest. But now there was paperwork to fill out, statements to give, and bounty money to collect. Plus, he was tired. Bone tired. Maybe it wouldn't hurt to stay a little longer. "I'll stay," he said, shaking the sheriff's hand. "Got nothing pressing waiting for me elsewhere." As the afternoon turned to evening, the story spread through Redemption Creek like wildfire. People who had been nowhere near the silver dollar suddenly claimed they'd seen everything. Exaggerated versions of the tale circulated, with some people claiming Clay had dodged bullets like some kind of supernatural being. Clay returned to his boarding house, wanting nothing more than to lie down and rest. But Mrs. Chen, the owner, intercepted him at the door. She was a small Chinese woman who'd come to America 30 years ago and built a successful business through hard work and smart decisions. "Mr. Morrison," she said, bowing slightly, "I heard what you did. The whole town is talking about it. You are very brave, man." "Just doing what needed to be done, ma'am," Clay replied. "You stay here as long as you want." "No charge," she insisted. "My husband was killed by bandits 10 years ago. Men like those Hollis brothers. You make town safer for everyone. It is small thing I can do to say thank you." Clay tried to argue, but Mrs. Chen was firm. Eventually, he gave up and accepted her generosity with grace. He climbed the stairs to his small room, every step reminding him that he wasn't as young as he used to be. He sat on the bed and looked at his hands. They were steady now, but he could feel the arthritis in his knuckles, the old injuries that never quite healed right. How many more fights did he have left in him? Today had gone well. The next 3 days passed in a strange blur for Clay. He'd hoped to remain anonymous, to collect his bounty money quietly and move on. But that was impossible now. The story of what happened at the Silver Dollar had spread far beyond Redemption Creek. By the second day, people were traveling from neighboring towns just to catch a glimpse of the legendary Clay ghost. Clay tried to maintain his routine. He'd wake up early, take a walk around town, eat breakfast at the small restaurant next to the boarding house, and spend most of the day on the porch watching the world go by. But now, everywhere he went, people stared. Some approached him for autographs or to shake his hand. Others just wanted to hear the story directly from him. He was polite but distant, answering questions with short responses and never elaborating more than necessary. The attention made him uncomfortable. He'd spent most of his life in the shadows, tracking men who didn't want to be found. Being the center of attention felt wrong, like wearing boots on the wrong feet. On the third morning, a young reporter arrived from a newspaper in San Francisco. His name was Thomas Green, and he carried a notebook and pencil like they were weapons. He found Clay sitting on the porch of the boarding house and introduced himself with enthusiasm that bordered on annoying. "Mr. Morrison, sir, it's an honor to meet you," Thomas said, practically bouncing with excitement. "I've read everything I could find about you. The Canyon Creek shootout, the Miller gang capture, the standoff at Red Rock. You're a living legend." Clay sighed. "I'm just a man, son. Nothing more." "But you've done extraordinary things," Thomas insisted. "The people deserve to know your story, the real story, not the exaggerated tales that get passed around in saloons." Clay studied the young reporter. He couldn't have been more than 23 or 24, fresh-faced and eager, probably thinking this story would make his career. And he was probably right about that. "What do you want to know?" Clay asked, figuring it was easier to answer a few questions than to keep refusing. Thomas sat down and opened his notebook. "Let's start at the beginning. How did you become a bounty hunter?" Clay leaned back in his chair and looked out at the street. "I was a lawman once back in Kansas. This was right after the war. Towns needed sheriffs and I needed work. I was good at tracking, always had been, even as a kid. Could follow a trail most men would miss." "What made you leave law enforcement?" Thomas asked, scribbling notes. "I got tired of the politics," Clay said simply. "Town councils telling me who I could arrest and who I couldn't. Rich men buying their way out of trouble while poor men hung for lesser crimes. I wanted to catch criminals, not play games. So I turned in my badge and started working for myself." "And you never regretted it?" Clay was quiet for a moment. "Regret is a heavy word. Let's just say I did what I thought was right at the time. Whether it was the best choice, I couldn't tell you." Thomas wrote furiously. "How many men have you brought in over the years?" "Honestly, don't know the exact number. 60, maybe 70. Stopped counting after a while." Clay shifted in his chair. Most folks focus on the number, but they forget these were real people. Some of them were evil through and through. Others were just men who made bad choices and kept making worse ones until there was no way back. "Did you ever have to kill anyone?" This question hung in the air for a moment. Clay's expression darkened slightly. Yes, not as many as the stories say, but yes. Some men don't give you a choice. They'd rather die than be taken in. I always tried to bring them in alive, but sometimes that just wasn't possible. Do those men haunt you? Clay met the reporter's eyes. Every single one of them, son. Every single night. Thomas seemed taken aback by the honesty. He'd expected bravado, maybe some stories of heroic gunfights. Instead, he was getting something real, something painful. What about the Hollis brothers? Thomas asked, changing the subject. How did you know what they were going to do before they did it? Experience, Clay said. When you've been in enough fights, you start to recognize patterns. The way a man shifts his weight before he draws, the direction his eyes go before he moves. Little tells that most people don't notice. The Hollis brothers were young and cocky. They hadn't learned to hide those tells yet. Some people are saying what you did was impossible. 7 armed men and you barely got a scratch. Clay touched the cut on his cheek that was nearly healed now. I got lucky. Could have gone the other way just as easily. People forget that. They want to believe in heroes who can't be beaten. But the truth is, any one of those bullets could have found me. I'm good at what I do, but I'm not invincible. They talked for another hour, with Thomas asking questions and Clay giving measured, thoughtful answers. The reporter was surprised by how different the real Clayton Morrison was from the legend. The Clay ghost of stories was a larger-than-life figure, almost supernatural. The real man was quiet, humble, and clearly tired of the life he'd lived. When Thomas finally left to write his story, Clay felt drained. Talking about the past always took something out of him. Too many memories. Too many faces of men he'd caught, men he'd fought, men he'd buried. That afternoon, Sheriff Taylor stopped by with an update on the Hollis gang. Thought you'd want to know they'll all be transported to the territorial prison next week. Judge came through and sentenced them yesterday. Jake got 20 years, Colt got 15. The others got various sentences from 5 to 10 years. They take it well? Clay asked. The sheriff snorted. Colt threw a fit, threatened everyone in the courtroom. Jake just sat there quiet like something broke inside him. The others seemed almost relieved it was over. Clay nodded. He'd seen that reaction before. Some outlaws lived with so much fear and stress that prison actually came as a relief. At least in prison, nobody was trying to shoot you in the back. There's something else, Sheriff Taylor said, sitting down. Word about what happened here has spread pretty far. I've been getting telegrams from lawmen in other territories asking if the Clay ghost is really back in business. Clay frowned. I'm not back in business. This was a one-time thing. I know that, and you know that, but they don't, the sheriff said. Some of them are asking if you'd be willing to track down specific outlaws. They're offering good money. Not interested, Clay said firmly. I figured you'd say that, Sheriff Taylor replied, but I had to ask. Truth is, there are a lot of bad men out there who need catching and not enough good men to do it. Then train more good men, Clay suggested. What you need is younger fellows with fresh legs and sharp eyes. Not broken-down old-timers like me who should be sitting by a fireplace somewhere. The sheriff laughed. Broken down? You took out 7 armed men in less than 3 minutes. That doesn't sound broken down to me. It took more out of me than you'd think, Clay admitted. I'm still sore from it. My back is killing me, my hands ache, and I pulled something in my shoulder. 20 years ago, I would have bounced back in a day. Now it takes a week. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching people go about their business on the street below. Finally, the sheriff stood to leave. The bounty money will be ready tomorrow, he said. I'll have it all in cash for you unless you want a bank draft. Cash is fine, Clay said. Easier to carry, easier to spend. After the sheriff left, Clay went for a walk. He needed to move, to stretch his protesting muscles, to clear his head. He walked to the edge of town where the buildings gave way to open prairie. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. He thought about what the sheriff had said, about other outlaws who needed catching, about lawmen asking for his help. Part of him was tempted. He'd been good at this work once, maybe the best. And there was something satisfying about bringing criminals to justice, about making the world a little bit safer. But another part of him knew it was time to stop. He wasn't the man he used to be. His body couldn't handle the rigors of the trail anymore. His mind was still sharp, but his reflexes were slower. He'd gotten lucky with the Hollis brothers. Next time he might not be so fortunate. As he stood there watching the sunset, Clay made a decision. He would collect his bounty money, rest for a few more days, and then leave Redemption Creek. He'd ride south, Maybe to Mexico where the weather was warmer and nobody knew his name. He'd find a quiet place to settle down, maybe buy a small piece of land. He'd live out his remaining years in peace. It was a good plan. A sensible plan. The kind of plan that made perfect sense for a man his age, but deep down, Clay knew something else. He knew that if he saw someone in trouble, if he witnessed an injustice, if innocent people needed help, he wouldn't be able to walk away. It wasn't in his nature. The Clay ghost might be old and tired, but he wasn't dead yet. And as long as he was breathing, he'd do what was right, no matter the cost. That night, Clay had dinner at the restaurant. The owner, a friendly woman named Helen, wouldn't let him pay. "Your money's no good here, Mr. Morrison. Not after what you did for this town." Clay tried to argue, but Helen was as stubborn as Mrs. Chen. Eventually, he gave up and accepted the free meal with grace. As he ate, several townspeople stopped by his table to thank him personally. A shopkeeper whose store had been robbed by the Hollis gang years ago. A woman whose brother had been killed by them. A farmer who'd lost horses to their thievery. The morning Clay was supposed to collect his bounty money started like any other. He woke up early, washed, dressed, and headed down for breakfast. But as he stepped onto the street, he noticed something unusual. A fancy carriage had pulled up outside the boarding house, the kind wealthy people used when traveling. 2 fine horses were hitched to it, and a well-dressed driver sat up front. Clay was about to walk past it when a voice called out from inside the carriage, "Mr. Morrison? Clayton Morrison?" He turned to see a woman stepping out of the carriage. She was in her early 40s, well-dressed in a traveling suit that probably cost more than most people made in a year. Her dark hair was pulled back and she had intelligent eyes that studied him carefully. "That's me," Clay acknowledged. "Can I help you, ma'am?" "My name is Rebecca Winters," she said, extending her hand. "I've traveled quite a distance to speak with you. Might we talk somewhere private?" Clay hesitated. He didn't like surprises, and this woman showing up out of nowhere set off warning bells in his mind. But she didn't seem threatening, and there were plenty of people around if things went sideways. "The restaurant next door serves good coffee," he suggested. "We can talk there." They settled into a corner table away from the other customers. Helen brought coffee without being asked, giving Rebecca a curious look before heading back to the kitchen. Rebecca took a sip of her coffee and then got straight to the point. "Mr. Morrison, I've been searching for you for almost 2 years. When I heard about what happened here in Redemption Creek, I knew I'd finally found you." 2 years is a long time to look for someone, Clay said carefully. "What do you want from me?" Rebecca reached into her bag and pulled out an old photograph. She slid it across the table. The photograph showed a young man, maybe 18 or 19, with a bright smile and hopeful eyes. "Do you recognize him?" she asked. Clay studied the photograph carefully. There was something familiar about the face, but he couldn't quite place it. "I'm not sure. Should I?" "His name was David Winters. He was my younger brother," Rebecca said, her voice tight with emotion. 20 years ago, he fell in with a bad crowd. Started robbing stores, then banks. Eventually, he joined up with the Carson gang. The name hit Clay like a punch to the gut. The Carson gang. He remembered them well. They'd been one of the most violent gangs he'd ever tracked, leaving a trail of bodies across 3 states. "I remember the Carson gang," Clay said quietly. "What about your brother?" "You tracked them for 6 months," Rebecca continued. "You finally caught up with them in a box canyon in New Mexico. There was a shootout. When it was over, 5 gang members were dead, including their leader, Thomas Carson. 3 others were captured alive and later hanged." She paused, her eyes glistening. "My brother was one of the ones who died." Clay's hand tightened around his coffee cup. He did remember that fight. It had been brutal and chaotic. The Carson gang had fought like cornered animals, refusing to surrender. He'd tried to take them alive, but they hadn't given him a choice. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about your brother," Clay said sincerely. "I truly am. But he was riding with killers. The Carson gang murdered at least 15 people that I know of, maybe more. I tried to bring them in peacefully, but they started shooting first." "I know," Rebecca said, surprising him. "I've spent years researching what happened. I read every newspaper account, talked to witnesses, even found one of the surviving gang members in prison. They all told the same story. My brother and his friends started the shooting." "You defended yourself." Clay didn't know what to say. He'd expected anger, maybe an accusation of murder. Instead, this woman seemed to understand what had really happened. "Then why track me down?" he asked. "What do you want from me?" Rebecca took a shaky breath. "I want to thank you." Clay blinked, certain he'd heard wrong. "Thank me?" "My brother was headed down a dark path," Rebecca explained. "He'd already killed a man during a robbery. If you hadn't stopped him that day, he would have killed more. Eventually, he would have been caught and hanged anyway, but not before hurting more innocent people." She wiped a tear from her eye. "You gave him a quick end. A merciful one. And you stopped him from doing more evil in this world. As much as it hurt to lose him, I'm grateful it happened the way it did." Clay sat back in his chair, stunned. In all his years as a bounty hunter, he'd never had a victim's family member thank him. Usually they cursed him or tried to shoot him. This was entirely new territory. "I don't know what to say, ma'am," he admitted. "You don't have to say anything," Rebecca replied. "I just needed you to know that not everyone sees you as a killer. Some of us understand that you did what had to be done. You protected people. You brought justice to those who deserved it. And sometimes, yes, you had to use violence to stop worse violence." She reached across and briefly touched his hand. "Thank you, Mr. Morrison. Thank you for doing what others couldn't or wouldn't do." After Rebecca left, Clay sat alone with his coffee for a long time. Her words had shaken something loose inside him. Some burden he'd been carrying for decades without realizing it. He'd always felt guilty about the men he'd killed, even when he knew he'd had no choice. But hearing forgiveness from one of their family members, that was something he'd never expected. He was still sitting there when Sheriff Taylor found him. "There you are, Clay. I've been looking for you. Got your money ready at the office. $8,000 in cash, just like you wanted." They walked to the sheriff's office together. Inside, the sheriff opened his safe and pulled out several heavy canvas bags. He counted the money out on his desk, all gold coins and paper bills, until there was a substantial pile. $8,000 exactly, Sheriff Taylor confirmed. "I've got the paperwork here for you to sign." Clay signed the necessary documents and packed the money into his saddlebags. It was more money than he'd seen in years. Enough to buy land, build a house, live comfortably for the rest of his days. "What are you going to do with it?" the sheriff asked. "Haven't decided yet," Clay replied. "Maybe buy a small ranch somewhere quiet. Raise a few horses. Live out my days in peace," the sheriff smiled. "That sounds like a good plan for a man who's earned his rest." As Clay was leaving the office, a commotion outside caught their attention. A young boy, maybe 12 years old, was running down the street shouting, "Fire! Fire at the schoolhouse!" Clay and the sheriff ran outside to see smoke rising from the building at the end of town. People were already rushing toward it with buckets. The schoolhouse was a wooden structure, and everyone knew that if the fire wasn't controlled quickly, it could spread to other buildings. Without thinking, Clay ran toward the fire. His age, his aches, his plans to retire, none of it mattered in that moment. People needed help, and he was there to give it. When he arrived, the situation was chaotic. The teacher, a young woman named Beth, was frantically counting children to make sure everyone had gotten out. "I'm missing too," she cried. "Tommy and little Annie." They were in the back room when the fire started. The front of the building was already engulfed in flames, and thick black smoke was pouring from the windows. The heat was intense, and everyone was standing well back, afraid the whole structure would collapse at any moment. "Is there another way in?" Clay asked. "There's a back door," Beth said, "but it's stuck. We've tried to open it before, but it's warped and won't budge." Clay didn't hesitate. He ran around to the back of the building. The door was indeed stuck, swollen tight in its frame. He could hear a child crying inside, a terrified sound that cut right through him. Using all his strength, he threw his shoulder against the door once, twice, 3 times. On the 4th try, it burst open. Smoke billowed out, and Clay dropped low where the air was clearer. He could barely see through the thick gray haze, but he followed the sound of crying. He found little Annie, maybe 6 years old, huddled in a corner. He scooped her up and looked around for Tommy. "Where's Tommy?" he called out. "Over there." Annie pointed to a corner where another child lay on the floor, overcome by smoke. Clay carried Annie to the door and handed her to someone outside. Then, with his lungs burning and his eyes watering, he went back in for Tommy. The smoke was getting thicker and the heat was unbearable. Parts of the ceiling were starting to collapse. He found Tommy and lifted the boy in his arms. The child was unconscious but still breathing. Clay turned to head back to the door, but a burning beam crashed down in front of him, blocking his path. He looked around desperately and spotted a window. Without thinking, he crashed through it, shielding Tommy's body with his own as they hit the ground outside. People rushed forward to help. Doc Stevens was already there, treating the children for smoke inhalation. Clay laid Tommy down gently and then collapsed to his knees, coughing violently. His clothes were singed, his hands were burned, and he'd cut his arm on the broken window glass. But the children were safe. Beth, the teacher, ran to him with tears streaming down her face. "You saved them." "Oh my God, you saved them." Clay couldn't answer. He was too busy coughing up smoke and trying to catch his breath. Doc Stevens came over and started examining him, cleaning the cuts and applying ointment to his burns. "You're a lucky man," the doctor said. "Few more seconds in there and you might not have made it out." 3 days after the fire, Clay was still in Redemption Creek. His burns were healing, though his hands remained bandaged. Doc Stevens had insisted he stay put until his injuries had time to properly mend. Clay didn't argue. The truth was he was in no hurry to leave anymore. Something had changed in him. The events of the past week, from the fight with the Hollis brothers to saving the children from the fire, had reminded him of something important. He still had a purpose. He still had something to offer the world. On the morning of the 4th day, Clay was sitting on his usual spot on the porch when Sheriff Taylor rode up with a troubled expression on his face. "Clay, I've got a problem," the sheriff said, dismounting. "A big one." Clay gestured to the empty chair next to him. "Sit down and tell me about it." The sheriff sat heavily, removing his hat and wiping sweat from his forehead. "You remember me mentioning that word about the Hollis brothers being caught has spread far and wide?" "I remember. Well, turns out one of the people who heard about it was Frank Dalton. He's the older brother of Jake and Colt Hollis. Different last name because he's from their mother's first marriage, but same blood." Clay felt a familiar tightness in his chest. "Let me guess. He's not happy about his brothers being in prison." "Not happy is putting it mildly," Sheriff Taylor said. "I got a telegram this morning. Frank Dalton and his gang are headed this way. They're planning to break his brothers out during the prison transport next week, and word is they're also coming for you." Clay absorbed this information calmly. "How many men does Frank have?" "Reports say anywhere from 8 to 12. All of them experienced fighters. Frank himself is supposed to be meaner than both his brothers combined. He's wanted for murder in 5 territories, and there's a bounty of $3,000 on his head." The sheriff looked at Clay with worried eyes. "I'm asking you to leave town, Clay. Get out before they arrive. You've done enough for us already. This isn't your fight anymore." Clay was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the street. He thought about his plans to retire, to find a quiet place to live out his days. He thought about the $8,000 in his saddlebags, more than enough to start a new life somewhere, far away from violence and danger. But he also thought about the people of Redemption Creek, the shopkeepers, who'd given him free goods. Mrs. Chen, who'd let him stay for free. Little Annie, who'd hugged him. All the good, decent people who'd shown him kindness. "When are they expected to arrive?" Clay asked. "Could be as early as tomorrow." "Clay, please, I'm serious. You need to go." Clay shook his head slowly. "Can't do that, Sheriff. If I run, Frank Dalton will take his anger out on this town. He'll burn buildings, hurt people, maybe kill someone just to make a point. I brought this trouble here and I'll see it through." "You didn't bring anything here," Sheriff Taylor protested. "The Hollis brothers came here looking for trouble. You just defended yourself." "Doesn't matter how it started," Clay replied. "What matters is how it ends." He stood up, his burns protesting but manageable. "How many deputies do you have?" 3 plus me. All good men. But none of them have experience with something like this." "What about townspeople who can handle a gun?" The sheriff thought about it. "Pete, the old lawman. He's still got good aim. Dutch from the Saloon was a soldier. Maybe half a dozen others who could help in a pinch. But Clay, even with all of them, we'd be outnumbered against Frank Dalton's gang." Clay nodded, his mind already working through strategies. "Then we don't fight them head on. We need to be smart about this. Use the town to our advantage. Set up positions, create crossfire zones, make them come to us on our terms." Over the next day, Clay worked with Sheriff Taylor to prepare Redemption Creek for the coming fight. They positioned armed men at key locations around town. They reinforced the jail where the Hollis brothers were being held. They warned families to stay indoors when the gang arrived. Pete and Dutch eagerly volunteered to help. "After what you did for this town," Dutch said, "we'd be cowards not to stand with you now." Clay also did something unexpected. He visited the jail and asked to speak with Jake Hollis. The sheriff was surprised but allowed it. Jake looked up when Clay entered his cell area. His face was thinner and his cocky attitude was gone. Prison had already changed him. made him realize the reality of his choices. "What do you want, old man?" Jake asked, but there was no venom in his voice. "Your brother Frank is coming," Clay said directly. "He's planning to break you out and kill me in the process. I need to know what kind of man he is." Jake's face went pale. "Frank's coming here, God, no. You don't understand. Frank is different from me and Colt. We were just outlaws trying to make money. Frank is pure evil. He enjoys hurting people." "Tell me about him," Clay pressed. "What's his fighting style? What are his weaknesses?" Jake hesitated, then spoke. "He's smart. Real smart. He plans everything out, doesn't rush into fights like we did. He's also patient. He'll wait for the perfect moment to strike." He paused. "But he has one weakness. He's protective of family. If you threaten me or Colt, he'll lose his cool and make mistakes." Clay filed this information away. "Why are you telling me this?" Jake looked down at his hands. "Because Frank coming here means people will die. Innocent people. And because," he looked up, "you gave me a second chance when you could have killed me. Maybe it's time I started making better choices." That night, Clay barely slept. He checked and rechecked the town's defenses, making sure every detail was perfect. He cleaned his guns, loaded extra ammunition, and prepared himself mentally for what was coming. Around noon the next day, a lookout spotted riders approaching from the east. 12 men, all heavily armed, riding in a tight formation. At their head was a man who could only be Frank Dalton. Frank was bigger than his brothers, with broad shoulders and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He had cold, calculating eyes and a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Everything about him screamed danger. The gang rode slowly down the main street, and it was like watching a storm approach. People scattered, diving into buildings and slamming doors. Within minutes, the street was empty except for the 12 outlaws. Frank pulled up in front of the jail and dismounted. "Sheriff," he called out, "I know you're in there. Send out my brothers and nobody needs to get hurt." Sheriff Taylor stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. Clay stood beside him, and deputies were positioned at windows on either side. Around town, Dutch Pete and the other volunteers were hidden at their assigned positions. "Can't do that, Frank," the sheriff called back. "Your brothers have been sentenced. They're going to prison, and that's final." Frank smiled, but it was a terrible smile, full of malice. "I was hoping you'd say that. Makes this more fun." His eyes locked on Clay. "And you must be the famous Clay Ghost, the man who took down my little brothers." "They didn't give me much choice," Clay replied calmly. "Oh, I'm sure they didn't," Frank said mockingly. "Jake and Colt always were too impulsive. But me, I'm different. I don't make mistakes." He spread his arms wide. "So here's how this is going to work. You're going to bring out my brothers, or me and my boys are going to tear this town apart, building by building until we find them. And when we're done, we're going to kill you slow, old man. Real slow." Clay stepped forward. "Or there's a third option. You and your boys ride out of here right now, and I'll forget I saw you. Keep running, and maybe you'll stay free a little longer. But if you start trouble here, I promise you'll regret it." Frank laughed, and his gang joined in. "You threatening me, old man? You got some brass, I'll give you that." His expression turned serious. "But brass won't save you. Last chance. Give me my brothers." "No," Clay said simply. For a moment, everything was still. Then Frank went for his gun, and all hell broke loose. But Clay had been ready. He'd seen the slight tensing of Frank's shoulders, the microsecond tell that preceded the draw. Clay's own gun was out and firing before Frank's had cleared leather. The shot hit Frank in the shoulder, spinning him around. At the same moment, the hidden volunteers opened fire from their positions. The gang scattered, diving for cover and returning fire. The street exploded with gunfire, smoke, and chaos. Clay and the sheriff ducked back into the jail as bullets tore chunks out of the wooden walls. From inside, they had clear fields of fire through windows and gaps in the walls. Clay worked methodically, aiming carefully, making every shot count. One of Frank's men fell with a leg wound. Another dropped his gun when a bullet grazed his arm. The crossfire was working exactly as Clay had planned. The outlaws were caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Frank, wounded but still dangerous, managed to reach cover behind a water trough. He was shouting orders to his men, trying to organize a retreat or a counterattack. But Clay had anticipated this too. "Now!" Clay shouted. Pete and Dutch, who'd been waiting on rooftops, opened fire from above. The angle was perfect, catching the outlaws completely by surprise. 2 more went down, and suddenly the gang's confidence evaporated. "Fall back," Frank shouted, his voice rough with pain and rage. "Fall back!" The gang tried to retreat to their horses, but Clay had one more surprise. He'd had some of the townspeople quietly lead the horses away during the fight. When the outlaws reached the hitching posts, their mounts were gone.